I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Adam Harris, and can you give him a huge round of applause, please?
I thought people would have better things to do on a Friday morning, to be honest. But I want to begin by just thanking everybody so much for making the time to come along. And hopefully by sharing some of my experiences this morning, and also just, I suppose, given the baseline introduction of kind of how I see autism and some of the practical things you can do in day-to-day life as a teacher, that will benefit your students as you move forward in your careers. What I want to say at the outset is just to say that I'm so delighted to be here. It's really, really important, I think, to have a chance to talk to teachers and to share these experiences. I'm somebody who was very lucky as I went through my education to have some teachers who are really, really well informed, or even if they didn't know a huge amount about autism, I think the most important thing was, I'm just going to start my timer here, I had teachers who were willing to actually learn, who wanted to actually open up and find out, and were open to the fact that I learned a little bit differently to other people. And I think that culture piece is what's so important. So I'm a big advocate for the very positive role that teachers can play when that inclusive culture is in place. What I'm going to do this morning, and I'm delighted there's some people from kind of the broader local community here as well, I am going to target what I'm going to say specifically at the teaching group, purely because I'm quite conscious of, in terms of time, I don't have as much as I would usually like to go into some of these issues. I'm very much going to focus on my experiences of early years and primary school, and then kind of close out with just some kind of top tips. What I'm going to say at the start, this is a shameless advertisement, but it's a free advertisement, so I can do this. It's that we do have a handbook on our website that can be downloaded for free. So it's a reference book called Back to School Survival Guide for Teachers. And a lot of what I'm going to say is in that, and it's all done in kind of bullet point format. So in terms of, if you don't remember everything I say, or if I don't get to say everything that I want to say this morning, I think that's an opportunity to follow up after. So that's available on asiam.ie, and I'll know if you downloaded it or not because I'll be able to see the hits on the website this evening. So I'd encourage everybody to do that. So just to start by giving myself a brief introduction. This is a picture of me as a baby, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a few moments. But from the word go, I suppose my mom realised that I was very different to my siblings. I think I was quite lucky in that I was the third child in the family, and even now I meet so many parents who, if it's their first child, it's very hard to know the little differences that are maybe there. And as well as that, I think if you're the first boy in the family, a lot of the behaviours can be put down to boyish behaviour. Whereas actually I was the third child and the second boy, and from the word go, Mom realised there was something very different about me. In fact, one of the things that was quite different about me is Mom always says that you never do something until you're ready, and then when you do it, you do it extremely quickly. And that literally started at the moment of birth, because I was 20 days overdue, and then I was born in 25 minutes. And I was 9.5 pounds, and I kind of think this is what I resembled a little bit as a baby, because not only was I 9.5 pounds, usually a baby loses weight before it leaves the hospital. I actually gained weight, and they used to bring in 2 bottles and say these are for the twins. And it's relevant to this story because from the moment I was born, I had this huge attachment to my mother, so she wasn't able to put me out of her arms for even 2 seconds without me getting very, very distressed, very annoyed, very upset. And at first, of course, these behaviours were just thought to be a difficult baby. But as time moved on, my development was quite different to my peers, and my mom was actually a Montessori teacher herself, and she had the pleasure of teaching me in Montessori as well as raising me at home, and she could see some of those differences quite early on. So it led when I was 5 years old to getting a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Of course, we're now abolished, so I don't know if I'm coming or going these days, but as a result, at the time, my parents had to make a decision that I think was a more difficult decision in those days, because you had 2 extremes. You could go to the mainstream school and just be seen as the bold boy, or you could go to the special school far away from your community with no access to an academic curriculum. So there was quite a stark choice the families had to make. I ended up spending the first 3 years of my education in a special school for people with autism. I was extremely lucky that after 3 years, and 3 very positive years there, and I want to emphasise that things began to change, and my parents found a very inclusive school within our local community that I moved to, and spent 5 very good years there with the support of a special needs assistant. before I moved to secondary school independently. I usually speak a lot about kind of teenage years and becoming an adult, because that's kind of the area I'm really passionate about, but I'm going to actually leave that piece of the puzzle out this morning, so you kind of will have to wait to see what happens in part 2. I'm going to just cut it dead at 12. And then today I run asIam.ie, so I set it up when I was doing my Leaving Cert, and it's an organisation that's trying to change public attitudes towards autism. One of the things that I'm very much going to emphasise throughout this talk this morning is that yes, some of the challenges I had as a small child came from the fact that I was autistic, but a lot of the challenges that I faced along the way, and a lot of the challenges autistic people face in society generally, come from how society operates. They're accessibility issues. And I think unless we actually change how our schools work, how our workplaces work, how our communities work, we're never really going to have an inclusive Ireland for people with autism. With all the investment, with all the interventions in the world, unless we actually change attitudes and unless we actually open our minds to how we do things, we're not going to build an inclusive society. So that's very much what asIam's mission is. Today we're an organisation that I suppose is within 2 halves. So the first half of what we do is very much what a traditional organisation would do. We do a lot of support and information for families. We provide an information website. We do a lot of things to kind of try and build the capacity of the community in Ireland. So we run events, we run training events, we hold conferences. But the other side of the house, what we do, which is a little bit different, is we reach out to all strata of Irish society and try and educate them about what it's actually like to stand in the shoes of somebody who has autism, and what are the things that they can do to be more accessible, what are the changes that they can make. So we now have a situation where we go around the country, we visit secondary schools. So we were in 32 secondary schools last year, worked with 4,000 young people to educate them to better understand their peers who are autistic. We work in third level places like DCU around making third level a more accessible place for students with autism. And we do a huge amount of work with our public services. So we've been training community guards around the country for, if they meet a person in the street, how to know if the person might have autism. What are the do's, what are the don'ts? So really trying to make autism something that's mundane, something that's talked about, something that is normal in society, because it is normal in society. It's part of society, and society needs to recognise that and open up to it. But I want to take a little bit of a step back this morning. And what I want to do is actually a little thing that I like to do at the start of every workshop. And what I want to say at the outset of this, by the way, is that I like in these sessions for people to feel they can ask me anything. I'm not going to get insulted by the language you use, by what you ask me being too personal. So in the 10 minutes or so we'll have at the end, please don't feel you have to hold back or there's something that you can't ask me. You're very, very welcome to ask me whatever you want. But I do think that there's a reality, and equally I'm not going to be judging what anybody thinks about autism presently. I'm here to share my perspectives. But I think there's a reality that sometimes when I go into school groups, the first question I say is, hands up here has heard the word autism before? And every hand in the room shoots up. And then I say, hands up here has heard the words Asperger's syndrome before? And you get 80, 90%. And then you say, hands up here who knows somebody, who knows someone or has met somebody with autism or Asperger's syndrome? And I might get 50% of the room. Now the irony is, if I'm in the school, 9 times out of 10 there's multiple autistic students sitting in the room. But so often people don't connect the theory to reality. So I'm going to play a little game at the start, and I don't want people to put too much thought into this whatsoever. We're going to go through some of these pictures on the wall. I'm just going to ask for a show of hands. Hands up who thinks this person has autism. Hands up who thinks this person doesn't have autism. And at the end we're going to talk about it, but please don't put too much thought in it. We're just going to run through it. So I'm going to start up here with the first image. Hands up here who thinks this boy has autism. Okay. The second image. Hands up who thinks this woman has autism. Hands up who doesn't think so. The third image. Hands up who thinks this man has autism. Hands up who does not think so. The fourth image. Hands up who thinks this man has autism. Hands up who does not think so. The fifth image. Hands up who thinks this man has autism. Hands up who does not think so. I've been using this slide for a long time, and since Donald Trump has been elected in November, everybody thinks this is Donald Trump. I want to say at the outset, the autism community does not accept any association with Donald Trump, and it is not Donald Trump. So bearing in mind that this man is not Donald Trump, hands up who thinks this man is autistic. Hands up who does not think so. Okay. This guy working in the kitchen, hands up who thinks he's autistic. Hands up who does not think so. Okay. This boy here, hands up who thinks he is autistic. Hands up who does not think so. And the final image here. Hands up who thinks this man is autistic. Hands up who does not. The final image is a friend of mine, and I took his image from Facebook with his permission. Every single other he doesn't have autism. Every other person on the board has a diagnosis of autism or Asperger's syndrome. And I always like to start with this slide because without even realising it, without any badness, we all have our own underlying prejudice of what autism is and what autism isn't. It might be a person in our life who has the condition, and that's what informs our thinking. We might watch The Big Bang Theory, or we might have seen the film Rain Man, and that's what informs our thinking. Or it might just be a vague concept of special needs or disability that we have in our head. And all that's fine in the sense that it's a starting point or a reference point for you. But the point that I really need to get across today is that autism doesn't look like anything. And that on a day-to-day basis, we meet people who are autistic. So as you grow older, if you meet a student and that person is in a wheelchair, you straight away have a sense of what their needs are. You can't deny that those needs exist. The problem for the autistic community is these needs are invisible. And when needs are invisible, too often we can dismiss them. Too often we can say, but they're not there. I understand that he's autism, but I think he's just being difficult. So I think there needs to be an awareness that just because we can't see this, that it is something that is very real. The second point that I want to make, of course, here is that this is a point that I make no matter what audience or what context I talk to, is that we do talk a lot about being understanding and being compassionate and being inclusive within our school system. But as adults, we don't hold ourselves to the same standards. And a lot of the people on the board are adults. And it's really important to remember that the child you teach in school, he will become an adult, and there's adult versions of him in your community already. So how many people within our community do we just say, oh, that one, she's so weird, she's odd, she's a freak, oh, she really annoys me. How often do we need to actually stop and say, could that be somebody who thinks different? Or could that be somebody who's autistic? So that's just an overarching message that I try and make, that this is something we're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And as teachers, if we're going to hold people in our class to the standards in terms of being inclusive to their peers, it's something that we do actually have to consider within the context of our own lives as well. So what is autism then? And there's lots of different definitions. I think the full definition in the DSM runs to something like 18 pages, so I'm not going to take you through it step by step this morning. The funny thing is, when you begin to look up definitions of autism, there's lots and lots and lots of different definitions. I put 4 different ones on the board there. I'm just going to read the one I like the most and the Irish one. So the National Autistic Society. Autism is a lifelong developmental disability that affects how a person communicates with and relates to other people and how they experience the world around them. And then, of course, the HSE within Ireland. So autistic spectrum disorders are a range of related developmental disorders that begin in childhood and persist throughout adulthood. So that's all very useful in terms of providing a legal or a scientific definition. But my difficulty with that is when you read it on paper, you still don't really have a sense of, okay, but what's it like for somebody who gets up in the morning and they see the world in an autistic way? What does that actually mean in practice? So I have a slightly different way of explaining autism. So I'm going to show you I'm going to in a moment show you a little video clip. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to break down some basic facts about autism, but then I'm going to pull them together into a little story that I like to tell to try and give you a more human understanding of something that is a human experience. So the first thing is it's a neurodevelopmental condition. So one of the main anomalies we have in terms of Irish policy, whether it's in the health system or the education system, is we treat autism as if it in of itself is an intellectual disability, and it is not. And there are many people with autism who also have intellectual disabilities, and that's an important point to make. But we need to understand autism as a different way of thinking. And when you're supporting a person with autism, and consistently education policies are drifting away from this, when we are supporting a person with autism, it has to be done through an autism lens. It can't be done through this general special needs lens. It can't be done through the idea of autism, intellectual disability, what's the difference? It has to be done through an autism lens. So it's a condition you're born with, it's a condition you have for your whole life, but it only becomes apparent as you see the person develop. Sometimes that's very young, and I'm going to explain my experiences of that in a few minutes. Sometimes that's someone much older as well. It doesn't always happen at the same time in somebody's life, the diagnosis. How many people have it? So as you can see from those pictures, maybe already you're thinking, well, okay, a lot more people than I thought might live in my community who have autism. So we've no registry in Ireland, so there's no figure, so you can't say X number of people are currently diagnosed with autism. We have a prevalence study from DCU 2 years ago, which says 1 in 100 people in Ireland have autism, which is a pretty bog standard figure that's thrown around there, placed globally. But right after that came out last August, the NCSE told us something very interesting, and that was that currently 1 in 65 students, or just under 14,000 students within the Irish education system, have a diagnosis of autism. So if we think about that, 1 in 65 people, so everybody very, very early on in their teaching career is going to meet somebody who has autism, and every single person here has met multiple people with autism already. It impacts on a person's abilities in the areas of social communication, interaction and imagination. Don't worry about that, we'll get back to that. It poses difficulties to sensory processing. It often includes heightened levels of anxiety, repetitive behaviours and a need for routine. And it's often comorbid with other disabilities. Not always, it's a standalone diagnosis, but we do have a term in our community which is, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that's because in the same way everyone in this room is different, every autistic person is different, but also from a more clinical point of view, lots of people with autism do also face other challenges or other conditions also, and that does mean that any support you provide for the student does have to very much be for that student. I think sometimes one of the things that can frustrate or challenge families is you can have teachers who come to an in-service and they come and listen to someone like me, or they go and they do a course, and at the end of it they come out with a particular experience or a particular image of autism in their head that mightn't equate at all with the student that's sitting in front of them. So it's really, really important that when you're meeting a person with autism, you're meeting a person, and you have to realise that that person has needs and that person's experience of autism is going to be very individual. But here's how I really explain autism. This is a video, it is taken from YouTube, and it is of a very day-to-day activity. It is people getting the subway in Japan at rush hour. I want people to watch it very, very carefully, and then we're going to talk about it. Gives you a new appreciation for Irish rail, doesn't it? What I love about this video is what just happens. So every time I show this, people laugh or flinch or they're taken aback, they can't believe it. But when you watch this, and I end up seeing this video clip more or less every single day, so I could nearly describe it scene by scene at this stage. But what I love about it is if you watch the people who are being pushed onto the train, they don't panic. They don't get upset, they don't run away, they don't even try and get on the train quickly. They really make the men earn their money pushing them on board the train. Because for these people, this is day-to-day life. This is normal. Because if you grow up in Japan, this is exactly what you do to go to school or to go to work or to go on a night out. It's just normal for you. But let's imagine for you or I, without any warning, without any explanation, if we were picked up, put on one of these subway trains and the doors closed. The first thing is it's going to be completely overwhelming to have that amount of people in your personal space. It's going to feel really uncomfortable, really claustrophobic. The second thing is that all these people are going to be talking at once, so it's probably even difficult to hear yourself think. Maybe the person pushed in against this shoulder has had garlic for their dinner the night before and doesn't believe in brushing their teeth. Maybe the person pushed in to this shoulder is wearing horrible cheap perfume, and all this information is coming at you at once. You just can't wait to get off the train and go about your business. So the train pulls into the station, the doors open, and what happens, what we all do when we're at home and we're using public transport, everyone pours off and goes about their business on complete autopilot. They go to their office, they go wherever they're going, they don't even think about it. But you've no idea where to go next. You've no idea how to navigate the station, you've no idea what to expect. We'll pretend for a second that you even speak a little bit of Japanese, so you go up to ask somebody for directions. But maybe, and we've all had this experience on holidays, it seems like you're getting too much information, the person's talking too quickly. Maybe even in different cultures, body language, facial expression, courtesy things work slightly different. So you're not sure, have you annoyed the person stopping them? Are they happy to help you? Are they telling me the truth? Or are they kind of winding me up? So at this stage you're highly anxious because you're in an environment that's totally uncomfortable for you, and you're also not able to communicate effectively with other people around you. So what you do, you're beginning to get extremely anxious, and you have to try and work this out for yourself. So maybe you look around the station to see, is there signs that I can follow, and if I follow these signs I'll know I'm moving in the right direction. I'll be able to work this out for myself. And maybe you find those signs and you begin to follow them, and you now have a bit of certainty, and as you're moving in that direction you're feeling more and more comfortable. But if even one sign is missing right at the very end in the last turn, where it's so obvious to everyone else what you should do, it's not obvious to you because you haven't been here before. And it's essentially, at this stage, it's like going right back to square one, because you're doing your very best to adapt to this environment, but this environment isn't doing anything to adapt to you, and it's really like living in a world or a culture not built for you. So if you can understand this concept, I think you can understand autism. It's like living in a world or a culture that is completely unsuitable for you. Sometimes I think when we talk about the concept of being autism friendly, etc., there's this tension of, well, the person still needs to learn to adapt to the world. But in this story, the person was adapting. But the reality was, even with all that adaptation, the world was unsuitable. I like this because people still like to go on holidays to Japan, but when they go, they like to bring a tour guide or a map, or they like to have a plan in advance. Small changes turns a very unpleasant experience into a very pleasant and enjoyable experience. And the third reason that I like this story is, this isn't correct or incorrect. It's just very, very different. And in the same way, a person with autism doesn't think correctly or incorrectly. They just think very, very differently. And I think that's what needs to be understood and respected. I think the next important point to make, and the final important point to make, is that I've given you a very extreme example to try and empathise with what the person is experiencing. But now what you need to understand is that an Irish student born in Ireland who is autistic, it might be as much of a culture shock to sit in a classroom in their hometown as this would be for you. It might be as much of a culture shock to get on Irish Rail or Dublin Bus as this would be for you. It might be as much of a culture shock to go to Tesco when it's busy. So day-to-day experiences, you're like the people getting the train. And for the autistic person, it's that overwhelming, uncertain, and sometimes very scary experience. Sorry. So on that basis, what I want to move on to, given the time that I have, is to share some of my own experiences and then finish up with some of the top tips. So as I mentioned, this is me when I was in the car insurance ads, Churchill car insurance, because I used to actually have this kind of layer of fat on the back of my head. I was such a heavy baby. And from the moment I was born, I had this huge attachment to my mother, so she couldn't put me out of her arms for 2 seconds without me literally screaming the house down. And this was such that for the first 7 years of my life, I fell asleep on her lap every night before she put me to bed. Now, when I come to conferences and I tell people this and then I go home, Mum always says, I hope you tell people that I tried to put you to bed, but I didn't just let you stay up and do what you want, because she has she likes to think of herself as a strict mother, and she gets horrified that people might think she was an easy touch or something like that. But literally the reason I had to fall asleep on her lap is I literally couldn't switch off in my own bedroom. I wouldn't go asleep at all, and as a result of not going asleep at all, the whole house would have been kept up. So the only option was for her to try and calm me down, get me to fall asleep, maybe around midnight at night, very gently move me to my own room, and then by 4, half 4, 5 in the morning, I'd wake up straight into my mum and dad's room. So as you can imagine, it was very, very difficult on the whole sleep pattern of the house. But again, I think a lot of these things you put down to being a difficult baby, until really those developmental things began to kick in, and there was some things about me, I suppose, that began to become apparent that they were very, very different. So I think the first thing to say was that I actually had sentences by my first birthday. So by the time I was born, but I was born in November 1994, and by the following Christmas I was able to say, Santa bring me car. So I had lots and lots of words, but I nearly had too many words. So in other words, pardon the pun, I would have a situation where I would say things like, I'm thirsty for my dinner, or I would constantly lose words. So I would know this is a bottle of water, and we all know what it's like to lose a name, but mid-sentence I would lose the word for what I was looking for, and this would cause huge frustration. And while I had a lot of language, how it worked, it was like me learning a foreign language. So I needed rules for absolutely everything, and day-to-day language would cause huge anxiety and stresses in the house. So one day my mum said to my sister who came home from school, if you don't sit down and do your homework, I'm going to kill you. And I said to her, well, what weapon are you going to use? And she said, well, of course I'm not going to kill your sister. And I said, well, then why are you telling lies? And I was nearly more annoyed with her for telling a lie than for threatening to kill my sister, because it was the idea of there being the truth and a lie and nothing in the middle. I was lucky that my great-grandmother was alive until I was around 10 years old, so she was a woman in her 90s, fairly harmless, but when she came to see me as a small child, and like children, she got down and said, you're a lovely boy, I'd love to take you home with me. Now this terrified me, and for 2 years, if she visited the home, I would hide. If we were at family events and I saw her, I'd start screaming no, 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 and run away from the building. And while it sounds very funny, these sort of things obviously people really didn't understand, really didn't get, but she said she wanted to take me home with her. So I assume she literally wanted to take me home with her. So language would constantly cause a huge amount of confusion and upset, as it does for a lot of people, and can be misinterpreted as a person just being difficult or rude or cheeky, but actually the person is just following exactly what's been said. And I think Ireland is probably the worst country in the world to have this problem in, because we speak in riddles. The other thing is I had very, very poor coordination. So while I had lots of words, I wasn't able to crawl when I should have been able to walk. I couldn't sit upright in my buggy. I constantly kind of sat back like this. I couldn't, so if mum sat me on my bottom, I'd constantly just fall over. So bad was my coordination that initially they actually began to investigate for things like cerebral palsy. And as well as that, I never actually passed my 18-month checkup because this was such a problem, so I'm thinking about applying for it again soon. And then the other thing was unusual play. So I think there's a stereotype in people's head that all people with autism are introverted and don't want to talk to other people. I was never introverted. I was always very, very extrovert, but I only wanted to talk about the things I was interested in, and I constantly needed reassurance and rules for everything. So I found it very difficult to play with other children because the rules change every 2 minutes and they might talk about things that I was disinterested in. So I was going to show you a clip this morning, but I don't have a connection. But if you watch Autism Me on the RSE Play, you'll see some clips of me when I was a young kid and I was having this problem. And one of the things that I would do is I would actually barricade myself in a corner of the play school, which I would call my kingdom. And if I got stressed at all, that's where I would go to, because I wanted to detach and get away from other people. And you could only come into the kingdom if you had a password, which was difficult because only I had the password and it was in front of the bathroom. But I had very unusual play, so I liked to collect things from a very young age. The smallest, I could be randomly given a present at a birthday party, but I always say that the toy companies target children with autism because what's always on the back of the package, the other ones you can collect. And something like this would spark in my mind, and I would want to collect them and line them up or set them up in an elaborate way. But that wasn't to prepare for the game, that actually was the game, if that makes sense, setting things up and feeling quite in control. The thing that I was interested in, I would talk about a lot, and to engage me at all, you had to use that subject. So if you read some of my early assessment reports, magic was the thing at the time, and I'm using a lot of scripting from the magic shows, and the doctor has to try and use this to actually engage me, because otherwise I wouldn't. But very much liked adult company and liked to talk and interact with other people, just not other people my own age. That said, I did want to, but I didn't know how to, and as a result I withdrew from it, or sometimes would do very, very inappropriate things in order to get acceptance. So for example, I've always been very tactile, so I like hugs, I like pressure, and as well as that, I was taught that that's the nice thing to do to other people. So at random points in the day I would decide that I'd go around the play school and hug every single child in the place, whether they wanted to be hugged or not. But there is an important point to make here about, and I think from an inclusive culture point of view this is very important, inclusive culture doesn't start and end with the teacher. It has a much broader thing around the whole community or the whole class and their parents. So, for example, a lot of parents had huge difficulty with me being in the Montessori school, or with me sitting next to their child, for example, because, oh, well, they're annoying the child, or it's very disruptive, etc. So there is a need actually when you have a child with autism in your class to actually build that culture of acceptance beyond the classroom as well. Because one of the things that does concern me is when I go in sometimes, and I don't do it much, but if I speak to very, very young children, they have no prejudice at all, and it's fantastic because they'll ask you the most invasive questions you can imagine, because they want to learn and they're interested in it. But you do see over time that shift, and all of a sudden them not inviting the autistic children to their birthday parties, all of a sudden not wanting to interact. And a lot of that comes from home, because children aren't like that. I meet them and something happens, and a lot of that is our adult culture polluting their openness to it, and I think that's a big problem. Obsessional interests. I would spend hours every day just running up and down, up and down, up and down the corridor on my tippy toes. And at the time my parents didn't know what this was. They'd tell me to stop, they'd try and distract me, and I would just revert to doing this. Now what I was doing was I was stimming, and I still do that a lot when I'm out and about and I'm in my own mind. Without realising it, I take off and I move my feet, and it gives me relief and I can concentrate again. At the time people didn't know what this was, and I'm concerned that sometimes people still don't realise that it's something that the person has to be able to do in order to regulate and get through the day. I didn't mix with peers, as I said. I relied on routine and rules for everything. So if Mom said, tomorrow we'll go to the beach, and we got up and it was bucketing rain, so she said, okay, we'll go to the amusements or we'll go to the swimming pool, that wouldn't be good enough. I would lead to a major meltdown. But it was never, and I want to make this point, I would completely rationally understand why we couldn't go to the beach. But the issue was we had a plan, and plans don't change. So why did we have a plan and now the plan isn't happening? So while I got the logic behind it, it was the issue with the plan being amended that caused me a lot of difficulty. No crowd, so I couldn't have gone into anywhere like a family gathering, because if we walked in and you're carrying a little child into the party, all the voices in the room would hit me at once, and often still do. Or if we went to a coffee shop, if certain things came out on the plates, I couldn't deal with the smell. So one of the big problems for me was the smell of crisps would completely overwhelm me. I couldn't deal with that. And I had a very limited diet, so even Mom had to do things like, say, I would eat certain foods always separately, never touching on the plate. Even, say, texture was a big thing, so sausages, I'd eat them. Mom would have to peel the skin off them in advance, these sort of things. And very challenging behaviour, and I'm going to say something interesting about this. So I was, as a young child, quite violent if I had a meltdown or if I became distressed. So I would kick, I would bite, I would go and get things in the house, and I would throw them and I would smash them and break them. And this was near daily, very major meltdowns. And it was a concern, especially as I was getting that bit older and getting a little bit stronger. One of the really funny things about that, it was probably the most challenging part for my parents, and probably what led to me getting diagnosed young and getting seen to and getting put on the right pathway. The thing that concerns me is I meet a lot of children now who when I meet them I see a lot of myself when I was younger in them, but except they didn't have the challenging behaviour piece, and as a result they're not diagnosed as young and they're not seen to as much because they don't cause a difficulty. And I think there's a problem with that in the education system at the moment, where we say things like the person with autism has a positive educational outcome because they were in the class the whole time. But often we don't measure, well, what was their experience when they were in the class? Were they able to engage in the learning? Were they actually able to follow things? So I think a really weird thing is the fact that I was very violent was an absolute blessing, because that's what got us on the correct pathway. And I think that's a funny situation within the system. I'm just going to push forward here a little bit. So in 1997, 1998, when I was being diagnosed, there was still a much less public awareness of autism. And I'm going to show you this in a number of ways. So the first doctor my mom brought me to, I think, was a paediatrician, and this was his response to her concerns. He's a big head, and a big head on a big baby, on a baby means a big brain. He'll be absolutely fine, I wouldn't worry about it. The second thing then they began to think was cerebral palsy because of the coordination. They did the tests, ruled that out. Then they began to think he's really distressed all the time. Maybe he has something like a brain tumour, something that's causing him pain that he isn't able to articulate. So they did brain scans, all of these sort of things. I should say when I was younger I used to have a lot of epileptic fits as well, so that was kind of informing that thinking. And then what society thought, and often does still think unfortunately, was just, he's a bold bat, he's bold, he can't sit still, he doesn't listen to instruction, that's what the problem is. So I think the main message that I have behind that slide is, it actually led to Mom, the reason I have that footage of me in play school, used to actually start recording me to try and show professionals, I'm not going mad, please just actually listen to me, because I'm not going mad. And I think there is a need, the point I'm trying to make with this slide, to actually listen to parents and to understand their concerns. I think often we can be very, very dismissive and not understand them enough, and I think it's vital to listen to what parents have to say. And then at the time when Mom was deciding should I send him to mainstream or a special school, and the principal of the local school actually said, so Adam will be coming here now next year, and Mom said, well, we haven't decided yet, he has Asperger's or autism, and she said, oh, best not send him here. So So that was still very much the attitude. Of course, that's now illegal, but it does still happen. So I spent the first 3 years of my education in a special school. First in one of the very early autism preschools, and then in a special school for 2 years. And we used to have a very long journey every day, and the Celtic tiger was just starting up, and at the time my special interest was to count property signs and group them by what company had them. So Mum used to have a very interesting journey every morning. At the time I would have started play school, I would have had a very big difficulty with abstract things. So even though I was so attached to my mother, I wouldn't say things like I love you. I'd say, how do I know I love you? Or how do I know I miss you? I couldn't get the idea of quantifying it. When I was in school, they did a lot of work with me with social stories in terms of sleep, bedtime routine, challenging behaviour, early mornings, and they did help a huge amount. There was a big focus on social skills, and I think this is an important thing that while mainstreaming is something I massively support, I do think it's important for the education system to understand that when a child is very young, maybe the parent's number one priority isn't English, Irish and maths. It might be much more about getting those basics right, giving the person the tools they're going to need to navigate the world, and then the other things can come. And that was the approach in my special school. There was a huge focus on social skills, and I think it's something that I benefited from a lot. A joint at-home and in-school approach, and this is the most important thing I can say. I talked about the need for consistency, I talked about the need for rules. Too often one thing is done in school and one thing is done at home, and that is really, really unfair on the person, and it's very, very confusing. There needs to be, unfortunately I think these days, there is a culture where before we even meet there's a suspicion, there's a tension between professional and parent. And that needs to be gotten over, and we need to open up the channels of communication again. I think it's really, really important. And I think it is the role of professionals to win that trust and to help families feel that confidence, because it can make such a difference. It was particularly important in my case because I was someone who could get through the school day absolutely fine because it was structured and there was a plan, and then all hell would break loose when I got home because all that agitation had been building up in myself all day. The advantage of being in special education was access to clinical support, which too often doesn't happen. And the other thing that my mum was very good at in my younger years was what Temple Grandin would call the loving push. So the idea of absolutely recognising the things I found hard, absolutely making adaptations for them, but also getting that balance right between that area where she could push me. And also I think the important thing was letting me control myself, but not letting me control the situation. So when I was younger, for a number of years in the house, nobody was allowed to eat crisps because of the smell of them. By the time I was in special education, if anyone was doing that, I had to be able to get away and go to my own room. And afterwards, they had to brush their teeth because the smell otherwise would get at me. But I couldn't ban and control the whole house, this kind of little 5-year-old. And I think that was an important balance as well, that I was given my adaptations, but equally I couldn't make everybody do what I want, because that was a source of tension in my earlier years. So I always want to say that I'm a big advocate for mainstreaming, but I do think that there is a problem that since we've begun to mainstream, we talk very negatively about special education, or nearly like it's an underleague of mainstream education. And I have to say that if I'm asked which is better or which was more important, in my experience both played a vital role, and I think that is an important point to make. So my time in special education enabled me to get to a point where I could move to mainstream education and actually have the possibility and the chance of learning. I just want to quickly do this before I move on to primary school. So I just want to give you a sense. When I was younger, my special interests would change a lot very quickly. And as I said, they could be triggered by the most random thing. I had one or two overarching ones. So from a really young age, I got into history, and that was kind of one of the ones that stayed with me. But they used to change all the time. So like Power Rangers, Aladdin, Noddy, shows on the television, guns. So Mom again was one of these parents. I don't let my boys play with guns because, you know, guns aren't toys, they're weapons. But then I was so difficult, she would have given me anything for 5 minutes apiece. So one of the things was, sometimes people ask me, you know, how do your parents feel about you taking time out of college to do all this advocacy stuff? I was talking to Mom about it, and she said, well, I'm relieved because when you were younger, you were so into guns and knives and handcuffs, we thought you were going to be some sort of serial killer. So we're actually happy enough with the autism workshops. So the first thing to say about national school is I moved to national school when I was 8 years old, but it was following a whole year where there was a very good transition process. And again, transitions are something that we don't do very well in Irish education at the moment. There was a buddy system. People began to visit me in the school. I began to visit them. Teachers from the new school began to visit me. I went on the school trip that year. I met them a couple of times, these particular students, during the summer. So it meant by the time I was coming, the environment wasn't completely unfamiliar. The two things I want to say about the school is I often meet families now and they tell me, they ask me what school they should send their child to. And the point that I would always make is that the most important thing in the school is the culture. So I've been to schools that have beautiful autism classes, but they don't have the right culture. And if you don't have the right culture, nothing's going to work. The advantage of the school that I went to was that it was very, very open, and it was very, very willing to work with my parents through particular challenges that I had. So where I want to finish before I open up for questions is to just give you a broad overview of my national school experience. The good things was I definitely benefited from mainstream education. And if you were the CNO and you came into my class in second class, my behaviours were much more difficult to manage, and you straight away would have picked me out as the child with autism. Being educated alongside my peers gave me a lot more social skills, and that was very positive. Educated in my own community, and I think that's the most important aspect of mainstreaming. And I think the really important thing to say is that when we are mainstreaming people, that there is a need to realise the whole community needs to be educated, not just the school. I was academically challenged, and obviously that was a very important thing because I was very academically capable, and that area wasn't being touched at all while I was in special education. And the most important point I can make is frequently thought through what I was good at. I can, not I can't. So when I moved to special education, I was 18 months behind the curriculum. My handwriting, which is still very poor, was this big. My reading was very behind. If I wasn't interested in something, and even now if I'm not interested in something, I just cannot do it. I cannot engage with it. But instead of trying to force me to get interested in maths or handwriting, my school took what I was interested in and try and use them to teach me skills. So in other words, history was one of the things I was interested in. How they got me reading and writing was doing projects on history where I could only move to the next page after I got the previous page. I had to handwrite them to a certain standard. So they were teaching me skills, but I didn't realise that they were teaching me skills. So I think the system is often stacked in such a way that we find out what the child can't do and we talk about it a lot, but we never actually find out what the child can do and use that to address whether it's socialising and making friends or whether it's an academic challenge. I think the things that were more challenging about national school was peer interaction could still be very difficult, and even when I finished school, because I think as the person gets older, more and more of a gap opens up again that I found very hard, so that was a difficulty. The yard environment in school was something that I found very, very tough because open spaces were very hard. So even if I was engaged in a game, it was very hard to stay focused on it. Without realising it, I'd be stimming over in the corner because the space was too much to take in. Not everybody knows or understands autism. And this is the most important point, that the most important thing for autism is a teacher who tries to understand and tries to get it. And the most negative thing can be when a teacher doesn't. No one expects a teacher to be an expert, but it's the willingness and openness to learn. And when that doesn't happen, that can be the most stressful and challenging of experiences. Language and expectation. I think this is an important point, that when you're in a class of 30 children and a teacher stands up, that everything the teacher says you might interpret as a direct instruction to you. So as a result, understanding what the teacher's expectations were in reality versus what I perceive them to be, being someone who likes rules and authority, could lead to a lot of stress and anxiety. Also language. So for example, I gave funny examples of language earlier, but more basic examples. A teacher asking for something to be done perfectly. Perfect to you means do a good job. That's not what the word perfectly means. The word perfectly means flawless. So I one time spent 4 hours on a join the dot puzzle because it had to be perfect and because the teacher said it had to be perfect. And no amount of my mom saying, well, it doesn't have to be perfect, made any difference because mom isn't the teacher. The A word was banned, and I think this says a big thing, that people always ask me, should we tell other people about autism? Should you tell your child that you have autism? I'm a big advocate of talking about and normalising it, and I can't tell anyone when I found out I had autism because it's something we always talked about at home. It was something that was allowed to be talked about to peers when I moved to mainstream, and it was very helpful. But I think it shows the problems in awareness within society, that we now have a situation where by the time I'd hit 5th class in puberty, I didn't want to talk about autism at all. Because most people wanted to be inclusive, but they didn't know what autism meant. So suddenly you'd find people just speaking a little bit slower to you, or people speaking a little bit louder to you, thinking that they'd be helpful, when in reality they wouldn't be helpful at all. And I think the other thing was that as a result of that, by the time I was finished in primary school, I didn't want to be associated with autism at all. And I think that tells us a little bit about the problems with how support is provided and doing it in a way that's more respectful. The other thing that I think is very important is organisational and concentration skills, were skills that I should have developed better in national school and hadn't, and they pose big challenges for me when I went to secondary school as a result. The final point that I do want to make before I open for your questions is that the role of my SNA played was extremely, extremely important. And I think sometimes within the education system, we still massively devalue the role of an SNA, or at times I think even how it's perceived within certain schools can be extremely negative and insulting. But I have to say that my experience of an SNA was somebody who gave me consistency as we went through a time of a lot of change, and was able to read me better than I was able to read myself. So was able to prevent a lot of very small issues becoming very big issues. And I think the really, really important thing is sometimes people are concerned about dependency on an SNA. But because my SNA did her job so well, I never became dependent. In 2nd class, we sat beside each other. By 6th class, she didn't come near me unless I came looking for her. But I have to say, it was one of the most important ingredients for me, was having that. I think if you were talking about mental health, you'd talk about one good adult. And I think it's the same idea, one person who knows you better than you know yourself. So I'm just conscious of time. So what I think I will do at this point in time is, we still have, I think, about 5 or 10 minutes left. So I'd be very happy to take people's questions, if that was helpful. And I think the SU or Emer is going to sort that.
Lee has a roving mic here, and any questions that haven't been taken?
Yes.
Don't be shy now. Nonsense. Use the opportunity. Use the opportunity.
Hi, Maria. I'm a parent in a local store who is currently non-verbal, but just on your challenging stage, she's currently going through a writing phase, and I'm just wondering how did your school or preschool and your mom, what strategies did you use to try and help it out of your challenging movement?
Yeah. So I think there's a few different pieces to that. Do you mean biting other people? Yeah, so one of the things that they tried to do was redirect my frustration and give me things that I could express my frustration on. So I had a punch bag, I had a lot of stimming toys, things like that. The other thing that they obviously tried to do was to try and manage the environment. So a huge amount of what frustrated me came from the environment. So limiting that was important. The other thing, when I used to get a little bit stressed or a little bit anxious, or even right up to when I was on the cusp of a meltdown, my mom started doing all the things that you, you naturally do when you see somebody distressed. So in other words, she would touch me or hug me or try and reason with me and talk me through it, or confront me if I was doing something I shouldn't do. What she learned as time went on was that doing that was like adding fuel to the fire, because at that stage my mind was already overwhelmed. So when I became distressed, she, once I was in a safe environment, completely detached from the situation. She didn't talk to me about it, she didn't engage with me until I was calm. Because it was, and then she would address it again, particularly if I'd been doing something wrong, for example. But there was no point trying to comfort me or trying to confront me when I was like that. So disengagement and giving me space was a big thing. And then I do think the other thing that, again, was clear was, within that context, there was also consequences to my actions that were clear and I knew in advance, and there was consistency to. So it certainly wasn't easy. It wasn't something that changed overnight. But I think consistency, understanding the environment, and avoiding confrontation were probably 3 very important aspects. Any further questions?
Hi Adam, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the Department of Education's approach to children with autism who become so crippled with anxiety that they can't attend school. This actually happened to me 2 years ago with my daughter, and I actually ended up homeschooling myself with absolutely no assistance. I'm just wondering, is the subject I think should be challenged by the autism community?
So this is actually an area we're doing a little bit of work on presently. We in April conducted a survey and we got over 300 responses, specifically looking to speak to parents and young people who were presently experiencing the problem or had experienced the problem. One of the things we found is it's actually a very difficult one to ask yes and no questions to, because often it's a culmination of lots of different factors that seems to lead to the person falling out of the school system. Also, it was also difficult to say only people who had left, because a lot of people were kind of in a legal limbo. So in practice they were out of school, but in theory they were still on the roll book. Or a person was in school maybe for 6 months very consistently, then out for 6 months very consistently, then so in other words, there was a lot of different groupings within that. What I think the common approach that I think it shows is that we have failed at mainstreaming, which is that we have mainstreamed huge amounts of people within the education system. And I'm, as I've said repeatedly, a major advocate of that. But we've done it in the most Irish way possible, which is say we're not going to talk about it. So we've moved people into the system, we haven't upskilled, and we haven't changed the environment. I mean, the amount of times, and I'll give this as an example, particularly for people who might go on to work in autism classes. I frequently get asked to go and open autism classes around the place, and nearly everyone that I've gone to and have opened, it's in a small room. They bring the children with autism in, then they bring the great and good of the village into the room, so it's really, really noisy and loud. Then they'll bring in the school choir to play the tin whistle badly. Then they'll get me to speak up, and I'm thinking of one in particular I did recently, that when I was speaking there was feedback on the microphone that was nearly putting me on the floor, but was particularly the little children, and people didn't seem to get the pattern of why by the end of my talk there was actually no people with autism at their event except me. Like, all the other children at different points had to be removed from the environment. And I chose things like, you know, when a school gets a new building now, it has to have certain standards. It has to have the wheelchair ramp, it has to have the lift, etc. There's no such standards around the sensory environment, and I think there's an irony that it's seen as something kind of novel, something kind of nice, but actually it's an intrinsic. A slide I didn't get to was autism is an accessibility issue, and we need to start realising that how the school system works can pose so many barriers and can induce so much anxiety. In terms of when children fall out of school, one of the big problems at the moment is there seems to be lots of different factors that may lead to people falling out of school, from bullying, which involves the piece that we've never educated peers about autism, to teacher training, which can be a problem, to the physical environment, to having mental health challenges and not being able to access timely mental health support. So there's a whole patchwork quilt of what the issues are that I think fundamentally come back to doing a whole review of how we can make the system, how we can autism-proof the system. If you look at what's been done in the UK with the Autism Education Trust, where parents can actually download, well, what is a good school for my child, and can measure it, and a school can measure themselves. It's a much more straightforward process, there's much more thought gone into it. But I think as well, what the separate issue and the more immediate issue that needs to be answered is, when a child drops out of school, what happens next? And at the moment what tends to happen is the person falls out of school and they're at a point where they need the maximum amount of support, but because they fall out of the school system, actually lose access to virtually all their support. And there is an interesting piece as well about the role of TUSLA in this, because from looking at some of the initial results of that survey, the role of the EWB team actually coming in and providing support has been very patchwork when people are falling out of the school system. And there isn't always a huge impetus on the school to try and get that child back into school, because they remain on the roll books. The school continues to receive the funding, it continues to have the allocation, etc. So what I think really needs to happen is you're probably needing a team made up of HSE, Education and Department of Children to look at how we can structure supports.
I actually contacted the Ombudsman for Children, and literally all the ministers at the time, and literally there's nothing they could do for me, because here, well, last year that's the criteria for home tuition. Under the bracket of the Department of Education, your child has to be sick previously. So my argument was, Kira has cancer, and she had been looked at, and that was entirely the story. So her constitutional right is abused, in my opinion. I'm sure you're familiar with that case, but it's a subject that's not aired.
Completely. So what we're doing at the moment is we have a team in Trinity analysing the data, and our hope is to publish a report and to use that to do a piece of advocacy around it in the early spring of next year.